Okay, here we go. On to SLD. Alrighty, folks. So for SLD on Blackboard, you're going to have a discussion board post, and all I want you to do is jot down some takeaways. Alrighty, so a quick reflection about SLD and how it relates to what you do as, say, a fieldwork student. Um, so just jot down some things that really stood out to you, alrighties? And I'll put the directions on Blackboard for the discussion board post. No more than a paragraph, which is 3 to 5 sentences of your takeaways, alrighties? Okay, here we go. Alrighties, SLD time, SLD time. Okay, folks, so in terms of SLD, it's it's called a maze because in terms of finding out what the heck is going on with this kiddo, the why, it can be a confusing process. We know that on one end, we know that this kiddo is struggling academically, whether it's reading, writing, or math, whether it's basic reading, whether it's reading comp, whatever it is, we know that they're struggling academically. However, in terms of finding out what this learning disability is and why and what their processing areas are, it can be a jumbled mess. So that's what we refer to as the SLD maze. So in terms of the SLD criteria, according to EdCode and IDIA, we are talking about a disorder that resides in one or more of the basic psychological processes. It's used in understanding or using language, spoken or written, and it manifests itself in the imperfect ability to listen, to think, to speak, read, write, spell, or do math. Alrighties, and it can include conditions such as perceptual disabilities, a brain injury, maybe minimal brain dysfunction, dyslexia, and developmental aphasia. Alrighties, so that's right out of EdCode/IDIA. In terms of identifying an SLD, the first thing we need to do, step one, is find out what the heck is this kiddo's processing deficit. So what is a basic psychological processing? So in terms of just going back to the EdCode IDIA criteria, I'm going to go through this lecture and define each of these sections to you, alrighties? So with basic psychological processes, it's the way we make sense of information that we get from our senses, alrighties? It's how our brain makes sense of this information. In terms of the processing disorder, it's basically a disability where this person's ability to use the information gathered from their senses, there's a malfunction of sort. This malfunction really creates ineffective ways of understanding information from this person's world. So, it can include visual processing, auditory processing, attention processing, phonological processing, sensory motor skills, as well as cognitive abilities, which are association, conceptualization, and expression. Sorry, I thought there was a typo there, but no, it was not. Okay, so again, I'm going to go over and unpack each of these areas, alrighties? So, how do we know when there's a processing disorder? In our analysis, it's really similar to finding a severe discrepancy. And we're also looking for areas of weakness as it relates to standardized test results. And traditionally, we're looking at somebody who is performing below their estimated potential, at least 1.5 standard deviations from their estimated potential. Alrighty, I'm going to show you a visual in just a bit about how that looks like, this 1.5 standard deviation away from your estimated potential. Here it is. So what does 1.5 standard deviation look like? Alrighty, love this little cursor thing. Okay, folks, let's use a quick example. A quick example would be, let's say, we'll use Kristen. So this is Kristen. Her overall cognitive abilities is a standard score of 100. So that's smack dab right in the average range, y'all. Alrighties? Great. So we don't have any concerns in terms of cognitive functioning as it relates to Kristen's ability. However, when we give Kristen an academic achievement test, let's say we gave her the Woodcock-Johnson achievement, but then we started to notice, hey, for some reason she's performing somewhere here. Looks like she got a standard score of 72 on her reading comprehension. So that in of itself is at least 1.5 standard deviation below average. Alrighties, 1.5, if you notice, even though this is -1, it would be -1.5 right here. Alrighties, so anything below this area would be considered a deficit or a difficulty. So with Kristen's example, her 72 standard score would fall right here. That is 1.5 standard deviation below her estimated potential, that 100 standard score cognitive functioning piece. We expect her to perform within the average range across the board, but for some reason, there may be a barrier. Maybe it's a psychological barrier to that academic or that reading comprehension, which makes her perform in that below average range. Alrighty, folks? Kabishi? Onward we go. So now let's start unpacking these various processing areas. To start off, we've got our visual processing disorders. Okay. Alrighty, folks. With visual processing disorders, it basically is referencing how the brain interprets and makes sense of information coming in from a person's eyes. Now, in no way does it mean that this person cannot see, all right? They can see just fine, but it's the process of making sense of what one sees. That's the issue that people with visual processing disorder tend to possess. Now, a key example is, say, like a task such as visual figure ground. This is where you're supposed to perceive and then locate an object, and there's a lot of busy things going around, and you're in a way supposed to locate this object without getting confused by all the busyness. Alrighties? And this skill actually prevents children from getting lost in details. Where's Waldo is a perfect example of this. So as you notice in this particular visual, some of you probably enjoyed doing Where's Waldo when you were children, but children with visual processing disorders, this would be a nightmare. Alrighties, it can be so overwhelming, so frustrating. Alrighties. It's hard for the eye to make sense of all this information and to locate the object or the person, or in this case, Waldo. As we move on, some symptoms or indicators of visual processing disorders can be a kiddo skipping words, letters, or lines when they're reading or writing something. It could be reversing letters or numbers when they're reading or writing. It can be problems copying from the board or overhead projector. It could be there could be a lot of tension when they're expected to read or write. They can have a lot of headaches or eye fatigue that gets worse during the day. They can have inconsistent spacing of words or letters when they're writing. Some common assessment tools. Folks, a key note here is the VMI is not a measure of visual perception. Alrighties, did y'all hear me clear on that one? The VMI is not a measure of visual perception. It's a measure of visual motor integration, which falls under sensory motor processing people, which is another section that we're about to get to in just a wee bit. All right, with that, we continue. Common assessment tools for visual processing can be the TVPS, the MVPT, the DTVP, the NEPSI visual processing, the KBC, the DOS, the RAML, the WISC, the WJ. There are components on those bigger tools that look for visual processing. Let's continue with auditory processing disorders. Oopsies. Oh no. All right, sorry about that, folks. Accidentally moved too far in advance there. All right, so let's talk about auditory processing disorder. This is essentially the brain has difficulty differentiating, recognizing, or understanding sounds and auditory information. Again, it doesn't mean that the person cannot hear or is deaf or hard of hearing. They can hear just fine, but it's hard to discern sounds. Alrighties. Now, in one example, we've got the auditory figure ground, and that's where it gauges the ability to understand spoken language, especially when there's background noise, like say in a classroom or on a busy street. So if you imagine yourself walking down a street, you're having a conversation with a friend. Someone with a auditory processing disorder is going to have a really hard time distinguishing between what their friend is saying and all the surrounding noises, like say traffic or a barking dog. Sorry about the beeping sound. My lentils are ready, or lentils are ready. Okay, anywho, let's take a look at this simulation. Okay, it says headphones required, but you don't need it. Again, no need to wear headphones.
There was a boy named Jack and a girl named Joe. They were both brother and sister. They were both instructed by their parents to get some milk at the market since they ran out this morning from eating cereal. Jill put on her blue coat as Jack got his hat. Jack was all ready to go, but with pairs of shoes to wear. Eventually she decided, and off they began their adventure to the market. Along the way, the dog street and immediately started. Knowing well that they needed to be home soon before it got too dark out, he left alone. Jack and says, "Wow, that's look pretty." Jill comments, "Yeah, I could just grab one and eat it." They finally made it to their time for supper, and at the dinner parents about their small adventure to the market.
Alrighty, folks. Were some of you able to answer any of those questions? All of the questions, maybe? You know, those later questions, I was thinking to myself, gosh, I was really distracted by the music. I was like, oh, this is cool music. Yeah, didn't hear a single thing about what the lady was saying. Anywho, hopefully some of you were able to get some of those questions. But for somebody with auditory processing disorder, that is a common pattern of their learning experience throughout. Alrighties. For you guys, that was just a simulation. But for somebody with actual auditory processing, it can be very nerve-wracking and very frustrating. So let's continue. So some symptoms or some symptoms or some indicators include problems following directions or repeating information that they just heard, possibly problems paying attention in class, possible delays in response time. So if you ask them a question, you pose a question to a student with auditory processing disorder, it may require some time for them to kind of go backtrack into their mind. Okay, what did the teacher say? Or what was the question? Okay, what did I hear? What do I remember hearing? Etc. Same thing like you guys just did when you were engaged in the simulation. Alrighty. Some common assessment tools. You've got the TAPS, you've got the CTOP, the SCANSI, the NEPSI Language Index, the RAML Verbal Index, the APAT, the Children's Auditory Verbal Learning Test. In terms of attention processing disorders, oh, why do I do that? Sorry. This essentially is talking about your ability to sustain your attention and concentrate on some aspect of information while ignoring busy external information that's irrelevant. Alrighties? Please know that you don't need a diagnosis of ADHD to say qualify under SLD due to attention processing. However, the attention disorder must adversely affect the student's educational performance, i.e., by causing that discrepancy between their cognitive abilities and their academic achievement. Again, it's that barrier or wall to their learning. Some symptoms or indicators include perhaps they avoid or they don't pay attention to schoolwork or other activities. They're easily distracted, maybe have trouble following directions. They can be forgetful. They don't appear to listen when spoken to. Maybe they're very disorganized. They lose things. They struggle with understanding new information or even connecting new information to old information. They may have a hard time attending to details. They struggle to organize their thoughts and tasks. They have a hard time waiting patiently in line. Some common assessment tools can be the Conners, which I've seen some of y'all do, the BASC, the Conners Continuous Performance Test, the RAML Attention Concentration Index, the WJ, the NEPSI. Here we go, sensory motor processing. This essentially is referring to a relationship between you've got your sensory system, which is made up of nerves, and your motor system, which is your muscles. It can be fine motor muscles or gross motor muscles. And it's the process by which these two systems, your sensory and your motor systems, are communicating and coordinating with each other. So for instance, like visual motor integration, fine motor skills, and sensory processing, you are essentially looking at the use of small muscles in the body, and then you're using it to complete some type of physical task. So for a student to copy notes from the board, for instance, they have to first be able to see the board, again, using the sense, right? The sense of sight. And then secondly, they have to process what they're seeing. And then third, use their fine motor skills to write down those notes or jot down what they're seeing from the board. Some symptoms or indicators include problems forming numbers and letters while writing, problems writing on lines, gripping the pencil too hard, or pressing too hard on the paper when they're writing, possible hand and arm fatigue when they're writing because they're exerting so much strength or pressing too hard, problems dressing, especially with buttons or zippers, problems feeding, including like holding utensils properly, or even problems tying their shoes. Some common assessment tools. Here is where you see the VMI, because this is where it goes, folks, sensory motor, alrighties? And that's where it measures the interaction between your fine motor skills and then your visual processing, because the child is shown a visual and then they have to copy and imitate that visual, right? You've also got the NEPSI sensory index, the trail making test, the KBC subtest. You've also got the Bruin-Nings-Oseretsky test of motor proficiency. Now that is given by your OT, alrighty, folks? OTs do that type of measure or tool. So let's talk about sensory processing disorders. Difference, okay? Look at the previous slide. It's sensory motor processing. Again, the communication between the senses and the motor system. This one is sensory processing. All right. This has to do with your nerves again, and it has to do with your senses. So you've got your senses of taste. You got your senses of hearing, seeing, etc. It's basically referring to the method where you are using your senses to understand and organize information in your environment. It's how people figure out how to react and respond to the demands in their environment. Alrighty. So for instance, if you go out into the outdoors, it's a very nice day today. It's very sunny. You may cover your eyes because it may be too bright for you. Righties. But for people with sensory processing disorders, this is the extreme. It becomes, they are either hypersensory sensitive or hyposensory sensitive. Alrighties. We're going to go over the differences. Now, this hypersensitivity is this oversensitivity, alrighties? You've got somebody that may find it painful depending on the brightness of light. It can be painful. Or you may have what's called hyposensitivity, which is undersensitivity, alrighties, where maybe the child continually bumps things but feels no pain. In fact, they may engage in injurious behaviors because they're trying to seek that sensory input. A child that is, say, oversensitive may complain about how their clothing feels. It may be too itchy for them, or it may feel like it's cutting them and hurting them. They may be picky eaters. They may only want to eat one specific type of food because of its texture. They may be particularly sensitive or undersensitive to sounds. Perhaps at loud noises, they may cover their ears, or they may be completely aloof and not hear any sounds. They may be impulsive or distractible. They may persistently walk on their toes to avoid particular sensory inputs from the bottom of their feet. Some common tools that we see with children who have sensory processing disorders. All these tests here are done and used by OTs. Alrighty, folks. So you may see your OT conducting these types of tools. You've got your SIT, your MFUN, again, the Bruininx Oseretsky, the movement ABC, the sensory profile, the sensory processing 3 dimensions. And those all look for these sensory processing difficulties. In terms of phonological processing disorder, this is referring to the difficulty understanding sound systems and speech rules of language. Alrighties, there's 3 components related to phonological processing. We've got phonological awareness, we've got phonological memory, as well as rapid automatic naming. Let's take a look-see at this particular kiddo right here.
Bang. Yeah. Is this girl clean? No. Where's this girl? She is?
Yeah. Icky.
She's dirty.
Turkey.
Good trying. So, dirty.
Turkey.
Dirty.
Turkey.
Good trying. Go. T. Good.
I don't know about that little flick at the back there, but you may have noticed how much difficulty this kiddo was having in terms of just saying the word dirty, right? So it has to do with that phonological element of making sense of those sound processing, your brain processing the sound and being able to state those sounds using those speech rules. Alrighty. So some symptoms or indicators include perhaps mispronunciation of a certain sound, failure to pronounce all the syllables in a word. For example, cat, k-at. Maybe they can only say kt, right? And they eliminated the a piece. Mispronunciation of a group of sounds, dropping the ending sound of a word, difficulty detecting and creating rhymes, difficulty breaking words into syllables, difficulty identifying the phonemes at the beginning and end of words, difficulty isolating or deleting or substituting phonemes. And you may notice some of your measures or tools you use gauge some of these symptoms or indicators. So, common assessment tools, you've got your CTOP, the TAPS, the Pfeiffer, the process assessment of the learn and reading, the nonsense word decoding subtests. All those look for the children's these difficulties right here, the difficulties in detecting and creating, breaking words into syllables, identifying phonemes, isolating, deleting, and substituting phonemes. Alrighty. Oh, I love that little red dot cursor thing. Okay, let's continue, folks. Let's take a look at the processing disorder and cognitive abilities, which encompasses association, conceptualization, and expression. We're going to unpack what each of these things mean. First off, association. This is the process of remembering information and then establishing systems for relating those units to each other. Again, folks, in short, this is solely looking at relationships. Can this child be able to distinguish and determine the relationship between two things? That's what association is. All right. In terms of symptoms or indicators of somebody struggling with association, these are kiddos who have long-term memory issues. They have poor cause and effect abilities. They have a hard time with part or whole relationships. They may struggle with either long-term memory or short-term memory. Common assessment tools for association include the RAND subtest, KBC, the NEPC, the RAML. Again, we're looking at relationships when we're talking about association. Can this child make connections between two separate units of information and call about their relationship, how they're connected to one another? With conceptualization, this is the process of understanding or grasping the significance and meaning of complex information and ideas. So essentially, guys, it is solely speaking about, can this child make sense of information? What's the concept? Alrighties. What is the meaning of this idea? Alrighties. Some indicators or symptoms associated with difficulties in conceptualization include trouble using information in a complex manner, having a hard time transferring and generalizing learned materials, perhaps poor abstract thinking, problems with understanding, reasoning, generalizing, and problem solving. They struggle specifically in the areas of fluid reasoning as well as executive processing. Common assessment tools include the CTONI, the KBC, the DOS, the TVPS, WJ, the WISC, WJ-COG, okay? With expression, this process relates to relaying thoughts effectively to communicate information to other people, whether it's oral, written, or gestural. Some symptoms or indicators of students struggling with expression, it can look as though they have very poor organization and expression of their thoughts orally, gesturally, or in writing. They may possess poor vocabulary. They may have a hard time understanding their language at age level. This is specifically looking at linguistic and academic knowledge, what's called that crystallized intelligence. And it relates to oral language demands. Some common assessment tools can be rapid naming subtests, DOS timed subtests, the KBC riddles and vocabulary subtest. You got your WJ processing speed subtest, academic fluency subtest. Let's continue. Step 2. You want to determine the impact of that processing deficit. So we've got 3 methods, folks. Alrighties. IDEA allows us 3 ways to determine SLD, looking at that impact. So there's got to be a severe discrepancy between intellectual ability, aka cognitive abilities, as well as achievement, which is the academics. The second method is that RTI approach, where the child makes insufficient progress even though you're using research scientific-based interventions. The third approach is the child has a pattern of strengths and weaknesses in either performance, achievement, or both. And it's determined by the group to be relevant to identifying their specific learning disability. And you got to use appropriate assessments, alrighties? Let's first talk about the discrepancy model. All right, so again, there is a discrepancy between intellectual ability, cognitive abilities, and achievement, the academics. Alrighties, and it can be seen in oral expression, listening comprehension, written expression, basic reading, reading comprehension, math. Those are listed out academic areas that you want to see these kiddos struggling in with the achievement. A severe discrepancy exists if there is a 22.5 point standard score difference or 1.5 standard deviations. Sometimes, folks, your district may change this number a little bit depending on your school district, all right? Just keep that in mind. Some folks may say it's 23 point, all right? It's just a variation in districts, but it should be at least the 1.5 standard deviations. And that's going to be between their measure of cognitive abilities and any one of the academic achievement areas listed above. Listed above right here. Just wanted to use that cursor again. Okay, so for instance, earlier when we had talked about Kristen, now let's do a different kiddo. Let's use Edith. Alrighties. So let's say Edith's cognitive ability is right in the 100 range, but her academic achievement falls in that standard score of 77.5. So already you can tell that Edith is struggling. Perhaps there is a wall or a barrier to her learning. All right, and this wall or barrier is that processing piece. We have to find out what processing area, all righty? Okay, now let's say you gave all these standardized tests. Alrighties, the kiddo is showing average abilities in the cognitive realm. They're showing average abilities in the academic realm on the Wyatt. So there's really no discrepancy. Oh no, what do? Well, according to the law, the IEP team can decide that a discrepancy exists anyway by looking at actual classroom performance. Alrighty, so you can look at things like grades. Alrighty, so let's say on the Wyatt it shows this kiddo's average, but their grades on their report cards shows Fs, specifically in the areas of all the anything related to reading, they're getting Fs in or 1s in. Alrighties, you can look at test performance, you can look at teacher observations, you can look at work samples, and that would be justifiable to qualify a kiddo under SLD due to a discrepancy. Alrighties, because you can make the argument, hey, our standardized measures show that, hey, this kiddo has got average cognitive abilities, but their classroom performance, such as their grades, show that it's below their estimated potential because they're getting all Fs or 1s. Alrighties. Alrighties, let's talk about the RTI model now for SLD determination. So, RTI, when we're talking about RTI, we're talking about, is this kiddo achieving adequately for their age or grade level when they're given appropriate instruction? Are they making sufficient progress to meet age or grade level standards based on their response to scientific research-based intervention? Are they making what we would expect a child their age or grade level to be making in terms of progress? Alrighties. So, core features of RTI, guys, it has to have high quality classroom instruction. There has to be a research-based instruction component to it. It has to be classroom centered. There's a universal screening that takes place. There's continuous progress monitoring. And again, that research-based intervention, the things that you're doing has to be supported by literature and science. There's progress monitoring during the actual interventions. And there's also what's called fidelity measures. That means there's a way of checking in with, say, the teacher or the person that's leading the instruction to make sure they are doing the script as it is prescribed. Alrighties? They're not going to go rogue All right. They are following the instructions and they're reading the script word for word. They're not straying far from it. That's what it means with fidelity. Key areas of RTI. We know that a kiddo that qualifies for SLD under the RTI process, there's going to be a trend or a pattern of low achievement. So classroom measures, state testing, progress monitoring data show that this kiddo is having a hard time learning with the academic piece. They're also going to make very limited progress. Even when you're frequently monitoring their progress toward a specific skill, you notice that they're not making any progress. Even though you make program adjustments, they're still not making progress. And then in terms of the role of the exclusionary factors, you want to be able to rule out those exclusionary factors. So you have to say that this kiddo, it's because of some internal processing issue that they're unable to learn. It's not because, say, there is environmental, cultural, economic disadvantages. You have to be able to rule those factors out. You also want to make sure that you can argue that they received appropriate instruction. So they were working with a teacher that was dedicated and committed to them, that followed fidelity measures, that really worked with them regularly. It wasn't some teacher that didn't know what they were doing, that was a hot mess. Alrighties, it has to be a highly qualified person or staff member. And then you have to also demonstrate that this kiddo needs special education related services. They somehow exhibit a lack of progress or they make very little progress. They fail to show progress even when you have appropriate interventions. And because of this failure or this minimal progress, they require specialized or intensive services to continue to make progress, to even make a little bit of progress. Alrighties, and that's where you make the argument that they need special education related services. With the PSW model, there are some main principles. Alrighties, so in this model, guys, the full scale IQ is irrelevant except for intellectual disability eligibility. Alrighties, full scale is irrelevant. Children classified as having an SLD, they're going to exhibit patterns in which most of their academic skills and cognitive abilities are within the average range. But then they've got these isolated weaknesses in either academic or cognitive functioning. Now, the model demands that we match these deficits in specific cognitive processes to the specific area of academic concern, without testing children with numerous measures in attempt to find a deficit. So in the discrepancy model, for instance, you may notice that you will have to give multiple tools to find out what that processing issue is. Whereas PSW, on the other hand, you are looking for a match. Alrighty, perhaps there is a cognitive processing issue that they are showing particular weaknesses in, and that is tied to an academic area. So say, for instance, phonological processing. They're showing weaknesses in phonological processing, which ties to their reading challenges, because we know that phonological processing impacts reading. It affects reading. Now, most cognitive abilities that do not relate to the area of academic concern are average or above average. Alrighties. So, with that, let's continue. Some other crucial principles, guys, is that we know that very domain-specific cognitive weaknesses and academic weaknesses are both found within an otherwise typical overall pattern of functioning. You got this kiddo that is roughly average, but then those isolated weaknesses, all right, folks? You've got those isolated weaknesses, and those weaknesses, again, have to be connected to each other. Like, say, your cognitive weakness has to be connected to the academic weakness. Again, with that, phonological processing weakness leads to reading weakness. You want to identify cognitive and academic weaknesses. These weaknesses, these connections have to be theoretically and empirically related. So you may use, say, the CHC theory. Alrighties. Now, I've seen people where they are not familiar with, say, PSW, and then they try to make a connection between things that are unrelated. So, for instance, a visual processing deficit has no relationship to an oral expression deficit, okay? Your visual processing does not impact oral expression. Capisci? Okay. Academic weakness must manifest and be observed in the classroom. If the problem doesn't present itself in the classroom, then it's not an SLD, folks. Alrighties? So if you're coming to observe this kiddo, it looks like they are having difficulties according to teacher report in writing. And you go to the classroom to observe them during the writing task, and you notice that their work samples show that they're writing just fine. It's not an SLD if they're able to respond to the prompt and be able to organize their thoughts and be able to complete the task, this writing task. So we've got now this particular chart that shows you the domain general and domain specific areas as it relates to cognitive abilities and academic abilities. Okay, let me move my cursor. Up here, folks, you've got your cognitive areas. Alrighties. On this side, you've got your reading achievement. On this side, you've got your math achievement. And here are all the general cognitive abilities associated with reading or with math. Then you've got your specific cognitive abilities for reading here. And then you've got your specific cognitive abilities for math here. So let's talk about exclusionary factors. SLD does not include learning problems that are primarily the result of visual, hearing, or motor disabilities, intellectual disability, emotional disturbance, environmental, cultural, or economic disadvantage, limited school experience, or poor school attendance. Some important considerations, folks. Oh no, what did I do? Whoopsies. Okay, some important considerations. I do not want to re-record this. Alrighties. So you want to factor in all relevant material that's available for the student. You want to collect data from standardized assessments. You want to collect information from parents, information from the teacher. You want to collect information on the student's performance in the regular and or special education classroom. And you can collect that through observations, work samples, group test scores. You want to consider the student's age, as that's especially pertinent for young children. Keep in mind that no single score or product of scores, tests, or procedures should be used as the sole criterion for decisions of the IEP team as to whether this kiddo is eligible for special education. You should never rely on one sole thing. Alrighty, capisci? We always want to make sure that all the data we collect is always triangulated and points us in the direction, illustrates some sort of trend or pattern that highlights for us what the kiddos' needs are, what their challenges are, and then we consider eligibility in terms of what best matches their needs. Oh my gosh, wow, that was it. Okay. All right, folks, what I'm going to do for this SLD piece is I'm also going to post up a chart that compares the RTI model, the SLD model, and the PSW model. It's kind of like a cheat sheet, alrighty, but it gives you a very straightforward summary of each of these models for assessing SLD. Again, these are the models you assess for SLD, right? It's not any other eligibilities, only for SLD. All right, with that, I want to wish you a wonderful week. And if you have any questions or concerns, y'all know how to reach me. All right, okay, here we go. Then you also want to make sure that you jotted down some takeaways, alrighties, and then you're gonna upload that onto our Blackboard discussion board post. Okay, here we go.